Alright, so Gara is an absolute beast of a Warframe. We all know that, right? Swipe across the screen, everything dead. Enemies shooting you, 0 damage taken, and even just casually bumping into a foe will immediately scatter their brain across the screen. So far, nothing new. However, earlier this year, DE somehow managed to buff Gara even more with the introduction of a certain new arcane. So, in this Warframe guide, we're gonna take an updated 2026 look at Gara with multiple different builds, near immortality, and hundreds of millions of damage. Big shout out to all our generous channel members, and now, let's jump right into it. But okay, usually at this point we would jump into her abilities. Don't worry, we will do that. Beforehand though, for this video in specific, I want to mention one quick thing. And that is that as of making this video, Gara Prime is currently still in the Prime Resurgence rotation for roughly 1 more week. So if after this video you decide that you want to get her and you want to jump in with the Prime version right away, then you still have a couple more days to farm her for yourself without having to trade with other people. Okay, with that being said, now is the time that we jump into her abilities, starting out as per usual with the passive. When casting an ability, you have a 15% chance to blind enemies in a 12-meter radius around you. This blind will expose the enemies to melee finishers, and for every consecutive cast that didn't trigger this blind, the blind chance will be increased by 20% until you finally have the blind, and then it gets reset down to 15. All in all, that's nothing really special, right? There are definitely stronger passives in the game. However, if your personal build that you're cooking up needs melee finishers to trigger some form of other effect, then keep in mind Gara is technically able to do that by herself right at the gate. Ability number 1 is called Shattered Lash. This one is kinda sorta Gara's bread and butter, and it is a big chunky ability. I mean, look at the wiki entry right here. There's a lot to talk about. Shattered Lash is a way for Gara to use glass to attack her enemies, and she can do that in 2 different ways. By default, if you tap the ability, then you throw out a glass shard straight forward, and it can also hit multiple enemies in a row. The much more common and generally better way to use it though would be to hold cast the ability, because then you kinda play Warframe Tinder by swiping across the screen and everybody is gone. No matches today. Now, given the fact that by default, the more useful way, the swipe, is the hold cast, a lot of players actually prefer to go into the options menu and then invert the tap hold cast for Gara. Another very interesting fact that we definitely need to mention here would be that Shattered Lash has no line of sight restrictions, meaning you can hit enemies through walls. And as we're gonna see in just a minute right here, the range on this thing can get absolutely freaking ridiculous, which is also the reason why Shattered Lash is easily able to delete every red dot on the radar without the enemy even being in the same room. But okay. Similarly to other exalted or pseudo-exalted weapons in the game, of course, also Shattered Lash is fully moddable and shows up as dedicated weapon in your arsenal. The stats for it are pretty okay, with a 20% crit chance, 2x multiplier, and a neat 30% status. Interesting side note here would be that the damage type is divided between the 2 modes that you can use it in, with Puncture being the damage type for the throw dart, and Slash the one for the swipe. However, what is very nice when it comes to the stats is that the range for Shattered Lash is not only determined by melee range mods, but also by your actual ability range on Gara. This way, you can get those crazy ranges that I previously teased that reach into the next room or maybe even further. One thing though that is not possible will be to mod for attack speed, because the attack speed value of Shattered Lash comes from your Gara's casting speed, and therefore attack speed mods don't even show up in the modding interface for Shattered Lash. On top of that, you can also not do finishers and not do blocking and not do heavy attack, so also the mods that modify these stats won't show up either. What will show up though is this right here, a combo counter similarly to other melee weapons. Whenever you hit an enemy with a throw or a sweep, your combo counter will go up to a maximum of 12x. This combo counter works exactly the same way as it does for all melee weapons, so you can use stuff like Blood Rush, Weeping Wounds to benefit with your crit, your status, everything as per usual. And also here, if you find that the 5-second base combo duration is not quite long enough for your comfort, then sure, you can also go for the Neromon Focus School and make sure that you don't lose all the combo, Or use the neat little Archon trick where you use 2 dexterity arcanes on your Archon, which will give you another 7.5 seconds of combo duration each. Whew, that was quite the information dump, right? So to keep it very simple, what you usually want to do in normal gameplay is build Shattered Lash like a normal melee weapon, and then swipe across the screen with the slash mode to hit as many enemies as possible. And yes, of course, we're also gonna have a bunch of different Shattered Lash builds, however I don't want to show them right now, but rather later when we talk about the actual full build setups, when it makes more sense. One thing that I should mention though is that there's an augment for Shattered Lash, this one's called Shattered Storm. However, even though it is technically an augment for Shattered Lash, it's actually sort of more of an augment for your 4, so we'll come back to that later when we talk about that ability. Skill number 2, Splinter Storm. Also, this one has a pretty chunky wiki entry, but don't worry, it's actually relatively straightforward. When you cast Splinter Storm, then you will have a storm of glass splinters around you. You can also cast this at an enemy or an ally, in which case the ally or enemy will have the Splinter Storm around them then too. If the storm is around the enemy, they will get damage vulnerability, and around an ally, it will give them up to 90% damage reduction. By the way, that is also exactly what it gives you. This 90% is very easy to reach with just 129% ability strength, so every build should easily be able to do that. And the greatest thing about this is that it makes Gara a very potent defense frame, because defense objectives do also count as allies for this ability, so you can cast it onto them to protect them a bit more. It should be said though that if you cast it at a defense objective, the maximum damage reduction is kept at 50%, not 90%. Still though, it's gonna help out quite a lot, especially in higher level defenses. What is much more interesting in my opinion though would be this right here. This value in the bottom right corner is a damage value, and it starts showing up whenever your Splinter Storm is active. So what does that mean? See, whenever Splinter Storm is active, you have a small radius around you in which enemies will start taking damage every single second by those, glass splinters of the Splinter Storm. The meter in the bottom right corner then is the damage that it deals every second. And while it might not look all that impressive right now, there is a way to easily get this into the millions of damage, which will then allow you to do what I showed in the intro, just running into the enemies and everything will just instantly evaporate. So right now, just keep it in the back of your mind for the time being. Also here though, Splinter Storm has an augment called Mending Splinters, which will heal you per second for every enemy affected by the storm. I'm gonna be 100% real with you, I'm not gonna tell you to not use it, just letting you know that I completely forgot this augment even existed, which tells you a lot about how much I am using this. Ability number 3 is called Spectrorage, and this is an interesting one, because technically it is a good ability, however on the other side in practice I kinda never ever use it at all. See, what it does is, it creates an AoE with glass mirrors that are circling around, and all the enemies that are trapped within those mirrors get confused into actually attacking their own mirror images. These mirrors have a higher threat level than players, which technically means as long as there are mirrors around, all the enemies trapped inside of them will just simply ignore you. Now, to be fair, there is more to this ability, it also deals a little bit of damage, and it has synergies with other abilities in your kit. However, none of my builds in today's video will use Spectrorage, and to my knowledge, most players actually throw this one out for something else via the Helminth, so I'm gonna gloss over all the additional details for the time being. If you want to read everything, then you can pause the video right here. This is the full description from the wiki. And yes, there's also an augment called Spectrosiphon, which will make it that enemies that die within the mirrors have a chance to drop an energy orb. Also here, it's technically not a bad augment, but given how many different ways of refilling our energy we have in the game right now, I personally just don't think it is worth it to keep Spectrorage instead of getting a Helminth ability, just so that we use an additional augment to generate a bit of energy. But okay, let's now talk about her big 4th ability, Mass Vitrify, which neatly brings together her entire kit with great synergies. First of all, when you start casting the ability, Gara will create a glass ring that gradually expands outwards. During this expansion process, Gara is completely invulnerable to all types of damage, which is nice and technically can function as a sort of panic button if you really think you need it. The expansion then will stop at some point to create the full glass ring, but if you want to, you can also just tap the ability button again to prematurely exit out of this stage. That's usually what I do. Now, this ring, or glass wall then, does a whole lot of things. First of all, and most obviously, it is a nice defensive tool. Enemies can't shoot through it, enemies can't walk through it, and as long as the full ring is up, it works great for protecting a defense target or locking down certain portions of the map. The health of this glass ring scales with your ability strength, of course, but also with your armor, and even with the enemy's maximum health for all those enemies that get touched by the glass ring as it expands outwards. So that kind of sort of is a bit of a level scaling to it. Now, also here, there is a lot more detail on the barrier formation and all the health points and how it's calculated, so also here, read it on screen if you're interested, and if not, then let's just move on. Besides the obvious defensive purposes of this ring though, there is a lot more to it and much more interesting if you ask me. For example, enemies that get touched by this glass ring as it expands outward will be coated in molten glass. This will then apply damage vulnerability to them, which means a multiplicative damage bonus whenever you attack them. That is already very nice. However, the main kicker comes into play when we look at the synergy between Mass Vitrify, your glass ring, and Shatter Lash, your first ability. See, what you can do is, you can attack your glass ring with your first ability to instantly blow up the entire ring and create an AoE explosion. This explosion can be very, very deadly because the explosion damage not only scales with your ability strength, but also with some of the stats that you modded onto your Shatter Lash. And this part is very important if you want to maximize your explosion damage. The damage of the Mass Vitrify explosion scales with only your base damage mods and arcanes, elemental damage mods and arcanes, as well as combo multiplier of Shattered Lash. So, if you want to maximize the explosion damage of your glass ring, then you should have one setup on your Shattered Lash that kind of sort of works like a stat stick in a sense, where you really only focus on these 3 points. Don't worry, I'm going to have a build for that later in the video as we talk about the specific setup. But if you thought that this was already it, then hold your horses because we haven't even gotten to the greatest thing of all. And that would be the synergy between Mass Vitrify, Shattered Lash, and Splinter Storm. Remember when we talked about Splinter Storm, I said keep in the back of your mind that there is a synergy coming? Yeah, this is that right now. First of all, when Splinter Storm is on and you cast your 4th ability, then it will automatically reset the duration of Splinter Storm to the max. This way you can basically just keep it up forever. What's more important here though is the fact that if you blow up the glass ring with your Shattered Lash, what we just said, then 50% of that explosion damage is permanently added to the Splinter Storm damage pool in the bottom right corner. You can see where that's going, right? By casting the 4 and then blowing it up in the enemy's faces, you're not only going to constantly reset the timer of the Splinter Storm, but step by step increase the damage as well. This is a very, very powerful synergy, and of course, we're gonna have a dedicated build for that later on. And then last, but definitely not least, now would also be the time to talk about the augment for your first ability, Shatter Lash. The augment in question is called Shattered Storm, and the reason we waited for that until now is that this augment basically is an augment for the very synergy I just explained. When Gara breaks the glass ring with Shattered Lash, then you won't only get the normal explosion damage of the ring, no, it will also deal all the accumulated damage on your Splinter Storm to the enemies as well, which also means that it makes Mass Vitrify a very good room nuking ability, and also here we're gonna have a dedicated build later in the video. And as always, if you could leave a quick like, then that would be very nice with the YouTube algorithm, so thank you so much for your support. Whew, that must have sounded very, very complex. Trust me, it actually is really pretty simple, and that's probably going to get more clearer as we talk about the builds now. And starting out, we will with a little beginner build. Given the fact that Gara is technically farmable without even having to leave Earth, that makes her one of the most accessible beginner frames in the game. So first of all, a quick little budget build. For the Gara beginner build, there really is no black magic to it. Aura is a placeholder, use whatever you like. Survivability is very good with her, especially early game, because you just won't die. All I did was put in Vitality and that is really it. Why is that? Because the Splinter Storm right here, as we previously said, will give you the maximum of 90% damage reduction already with just 129% ability strength. That means just using normal Intensify right here is already enough. I think this was a conscious decision to make it more approachable for early game players. In addition to that, we then use Continuity right here to get a bit more ability duration, and because Gara is a frame that likes to cast abilities a lot, we do want to go with Streamline so we can do that a bit more efficiently, as well as Flow for more maximum energy, and Equilibrium so we can fill the energy up with health orbs as well. Little beginner tip on the side here, the combination of Equilibrium as well as a Diriga companion with Synth Deconstruct is one of the most broken power spikes that you can have as a beginner. In case you're new to the game and you're interested, I have a full video on this synergy over on my second channel. I'm gonna try to put it in the cards up in the corner. And then lastly, because a lot of abilities from Gara like range, we're gonna go for Stretch as well as Augur Reach to have a nice 175 of that. However, the Gara build itself is of course not everything, because we also have Shattered Lash and naturally I have a beginner build for you here too. What we do is pretty self-explanatory. Pressure Point for more damage, True Steel for more crit chance, and Organ Shatter for more critical damage, increasing all the important values. We then add whichever elements we want. I personally went for Corrosive and Heat, but you can mix up whatever you want, and also depending on which enemy faction you're going up against. And then I decided to also go for more status chance with Melee Prowess and Reach to add even more range. And this one is a little bit flexible because as you can see, through all the ability range that we have, we already are surpassing 20 meters. So if you wanted to, you can just literally use anything else for this one. The 1.5 here doesn't make all too much of a difference. But now, with the beginner build out of the way, let's talk about some more steel pathy builds, where I have 3 different ones prepared for you in this video. And the first build on the list would be a very mainstream Shattered Lash focused build, where you're basically just playing to swipe the screen clean of anything hostile. Question number 1. Which Helminth ability do we use? And the answer here is actually pretty darn simple. Technically, you can go for absolutely whatever you like. You can go Invisible if you think you want to do that, you can go for Nourish, you can go for Roar if you want to have more damage. You can, there's no necessity for any specific ability. But, given the fact that Shattered Lash is, of course, technically a melee weapon, that means that we can use Wrathful Advance to make the funny red numbers, and that is exactly what this build does. Question number 2, Archon Shards. Also here, no specific necessities, but this right here is a nice overall thing to do. We'll go for more casting speed, which will also increase the attack speed of Shattered Lash, and then we also go for purple ones, which give us more melee crit damage, and then if the max energy is over 500, the crit damage boost gets doubled. With Gara Prime and the Primed Flow mod, that is absolutely no problem with 641 energy. If you wanted to though, you can also mix and match however you like, you can go for other shards, personal preference, none of this here is absolutely necessary. Let's though talk the build itself, and here I first want to showcase the Gara build. This right here is what I'm working with, and before we jump into every single mod and arcane here, let me just say that a lot of what you're seeing here is personal preference. For example, if you feel that the 90% damage reduction of Splinter Storm is more than enough, you can drop adaptation. If you want to have a different aura, you go and do that. You want to have a different Excellence slot, I think you get what I'm trying to say. What we do with this build is a lot of ability strength. 243% right now. If Mold Augmented is fully stacked, that's over 300%. We also have Growing Power, we have Blind Rage, Umbral Intensify. It's a strong build. This boost in ability strength will mean that Wrathful Advance gives us a lot more crit chance, and also Shattered Lash has good base damage. We then go for Stretch to increase our ability range, which we mainly do for Shattered Lash because, as we previously said, the range of the melee attack from Shattered Lash scales with our ability range. One thing I want to say on the side here, if you wanted to and you want to have even more range, which is perfectly reasonable, you could add Augur Reach. You could also replace Stretch with Overextended if you want to sacrifice a little bit of ability strength for even more range. That is perfectly viable as well. If you want to go with Stretch though, then you could technically also go and use the Archon version of Stretch if you have a companion that can trigger electricity with abilities, like for example Diriga, that will trigger Archon Stretch and that will give you a bit of energy per second. I don't think you need it, just wanted to say that. In order to never die, we go with Primed Redirection as well as Arcane Aegis for the shield refill, and combine that with a neat 90% damage reduction from Splinter Storm as well as adaptation for another layer of up to 90%. This way, you get survivability like I showed in the video intro. You're gonna just face tank Steel Path, no problem. As I said, if you don't think you need adaptation, just get rid of it, use whatever. What is more important and much more interesting in my opinion with this Gara build is not the Gara herself, but more the Shatter Lash, because we have quite a lot of options as to how we want to fine-tune it for this build. First of all, what we have right here is one of the most standard melee builds you will ever see in this game, a melee influence. We do have a pretty good status chance at base, 30%, and that means if we add electricity onto the weapon, we can use melee influence and not only hit all the enemies in the massive range of Shatter Lash, but expand the AoE even more because melee influence has an AoE of itself. This is the build that you want to go for if you just want to clear the entire map with one cast off of any type of small fodder enemy. And sure thing, if we use this in practice with Wrathful Advance, bada bing bada boom, absolutely everything is dead. And that was just at a combo multiplier of 0. However though, if you don't necessarily need the massive AoE of melee influence, then you can do with the melee afflictions build. This one is based on the fact that enemies get knocked down whenever you cast the ability, and that is very crucial here. See, melee afflictions will take any DOT effects on the enemy, and when they get knocked down, then it will add another 6 stacks of that very same DOT effect. In other words, if we knock down the enemies with a big heavy slash hit at the same time, we're gonna get 7 heavy slash hits as you also just saw. This won't have the crazy AoE capacity of a melee influence build, but with 7 heavy slashes, this can deal massive damage as well. But yeah, melee influence, melee afflictions, so far nothing new. What is, in my opinion, much more interesting, albeit a bit more niche, would be a melee doty setup, something like this right here. Melee doty is a very interesting arcane. For every 10% of puncture status chance that your melee weapon has, you gain a flat 1.0 times crit damage multiplier. And yeah, if we do not use the swipe, but rather the toss of the shard, then we have 100% damage being puncture with still a massive status chance. And this is exactly what we're doing right here. We go for Galvanized Steel and Blood Rush for the crit, Condition Overload and Prime Pressure Point for base damage, and also a faction damage mod because, you know, faction damage is multiplicative damage bonus. However, what we do here is we focus on a whole bunch of status chance with Weeping Wound, Elementalist, which gives us another 120% status chance. We go for Juggler's Barbs, which gives us 60% status chance on top. And because we are at 100% puncture damage, you can also see it in the top right corner of the screen, once we are at 12x combo multiplier, we have 21.6 times additional crit damage multiplier. See right here? This is absolutely insane. The crit damage, especially if you combine it with Wrathful Advance as a crit chance, bada boom. That's 1 million without status priming. If we go with status priming, we deal 130 million with one toss of the glass shard. Of course though, and this is very important to mention, this only goes for the glass shard throw because it deals puncture. If we do the swipe, which deals slash, then we are not benefiting from melee doty whatsoever. Now, of course, this scenario that I just showcased might have been a little bit very constructed and not practical, so let me also show you a sub-version of this build, which is a bit more fun to use in practice. And this would be a melee doty gas version. What we do right here is we toss out a bit of crit and we also toss out prime pressure point because, we have condition overload or vice versa, whatever you see fit. And instead, we add gas. This, of course, means that the relative puncture status chance is a little bit lower than with the purely puncture build, which translates into, I think, 15x extra crit damage instead of 20, but it's still massive, and I think it's perfectly worth it. The reason why this is so strong now is we can group enemies up with something like the Sciatid right here, and if we then throw the Shard, you just take out absolutely everybody with these massive gas clouds that we cause with the gas damage. I personally also went ahead and tried it with Blast, but Blast wasn't really reliable. The gas clouds, though, are absolute cinema because they are so incredibly strong. So yeah, if you ever want to play a Gara that works a tiny little bit different than the classical Tinder swipe left, swipe right one, then Melee Doty Gas is actually very, very fun. Lastly then, I want to take a minute to talk about combo duration, because as I previously mentioned in I think it was the ability section, what you could do is go with Neramon, for example. Neramon has Power Spike, which makes it that your combo multiplier only goes down by 5 every few seconds, basically locking you at a 12x so you don't have to worry about that anymore. If you want to go with a different focus school for whatever reason, like Madarai for more ability strength or whatever, that is no problem either, because what you could do is you go for any type of Archon of your choice and use a build like this. Absolutely everything empty, but you go with primary dexterity and secondary dexterity. Both of these give you 7.5 additional seconds of combo duration, so 15 in total, and you don't even have to have the Archon equipped, you don't have to do anything with it, it just needs to be in your pocket, and that gives you these extra seconds, which is basically long enough so that you don't have to worry about anything. Steel Path build number 2 that I want to showcase is one of the funniest builds that you can play, because all you need to do is just run into the enemy, and once you bump into them, they're just gonna explode. Let's talk about the Splinter Storm only one. Now, first of all, also here let's talk Helminth abilities. And here you're a bit more narrowed down, but you also have a couple of options. You can go for Roar because, Roar is a universal damage bonus, blah blah, it increases the damage of Splinter Storm, we all know it, we love to see it. However, if you want to go for more energy economy, you could go for Nourish. Not only helps with the energy income, but also you create these passive viral explosions whenever you take damage, which will viral prime the enemies around you, and that also means you deal more damage. Probably this one here would technically even be my favorite over Roar for this. Next topic of the day, Archon Shards. Because it's the same Gara, I of course have the same shards, but technically if you wanted to max out this specific build, you would use something else. Casting speed, that is perfectly fine, but the purple ones you don't need it because we're not going to deal melee damage with our Shattered Lash. Instead you can go for more ability strength, for example, which would increase the damage output. Alternatively, more shields can also be good, not only for survivability, but also for damage output. We're gonna get into that in just a split second. And everything else, of course, also works. Now, first of all, before we get into the Gara build itself, let's talk about the Shattered Lash build. Because right here, it is very important that we build Shattered Lash as a support tool and not as the main damage dealer like we did before. Remember how in the skill section I said that the explosion damage of your glass ring, that scales with the base damage, elemental damage, and combo multiplier on Shattered Lash? Well, this is exactly this support build that we're using right here. We go with Pressure Point, Spoiled Strike, and then also, because we're going to use the Slash version of it to crack the ring, Jagged Edge and Buzzkill to just get the number as big as we can. Then we also use all the elemental mods that we can, Northwind, Primed Fever Strike, Molten Impact, Shocking Touch. We don't care about which elements we have, doesn't matter whatsoever, we just want number big as much as possible. In the Arcane then, we have a choice between two different ones. We can go for something like Melee Exposure, which will give us 240% in elemental damage in the form of Corrosive. That is definitely viable and very nice. However, we can also use a Melee Retaliation. This will give us base damage based on how many current shields we have. This is also why I said blue Archon charts into more shields is technically a thing you could do. The more shields your Gara has, the more damage this will give you, and overall, if you don't go up against that high enemies that just one-shot your shields, this one right here is technically the stronger option. However, how does all of this help with our Splinter Storm now? Let's take a look at how this build is supposed to be used. First of all, we of course need to get our Shattered Lash up to 12x. We then go and activate our Splinter Storm so that we have the damage counter in the bottom right corner, cast Masked Vitrify to glass the enemies, and then blow up the ring with our Shattered Lash. As you can see right here, that was quite a lot of damage with just one cast. And then we basically go and repeat the whole process as much as we want to scale up the damage further and further until we're happy with the damage of our Splinter Storm, at which point we can just run into the enemies and they all die. Of course, in this example here, 300,000 is not that crazy, but as you saw, this can go up pretty high and you can get into the millions in just 1-2 minutes, no problem. Let's though now look at the Gara build itself. In the aura, I went for corrosive projection because reducing enemy armor means that our Splinter Storm right here will, as a consequence, deal more damage per hit. If you don't want to do this, you can go for something else. For example, you could go for Steel Charge, which not only gives you more mod capacity because it's an 18-1, but this one gives you more damage onto your Splinter Storm as well, which will in turn then increase the scaling even a bit more. Preparation, personal convenience, can replace if you want to, and then the rest of the build mainly focuses on maxing range. This is technically not 100% necessary, but I just like to have around about a 6-meter radius of Splinter Storm. Makes it more convenient to play because you basically happen to lock down the entire hallway if you walk down one. The survivability comes from adaptation as well as, your Splinter Storm and the redirection shield tank approach. However, Arcane Aegis right here, which refills our shields, is technically optional. If you feel like redirection and adaptation and the Splinter Storm is tanky enough and you don't need the refill, then what you can do is, you can go for Arcane Expertise right here. This will take your ability strength modifier and turn that into shields as well. This way, you increase our shields, and more shields mean that you get more damage out of melee retaliation right here, which means your scaling will be even faster. That is one option that you have. In this case, you might want to go for a bit more ability strength as well, so you can really capitalize on Arcane Expertise. Energy economy then though, that becomes very interesting. First of all, as you see right here, we don't even use a flow mod. The reason for that is that we use Arcane Sculptor. This will give us a massive 175% ability efficiency when we create like an object with an ability. And the glass wall from our 4th ability counts as this object. So when we cast this one, we lock our ability efficiency at 175%, which is absolutely amazing and means that we don't have any energy issues with Blind Rage or anything whatsoever. All we then do here is go for Archon Stretch for 2 energy per second, as well as Equilibrium, and we are good to go. If, however, you use Nourish instead of Pull or Roar, then you don't even need Equilibrium. Nourish alone, plus Archon Stretch, plus maybe something like the Xeneric Focus School with the Wellspring that gives you 5 energy per second more, that is going to generate more than enough energy to fully run this ability spam heavy setup right here without needing anything else. So you could replace Equilibrium with more ability strength. And last but definitely, oh boy, definitely not least, let's talk about the absolute ultimate room nuke ability that takes all the damage from Splinter Storm that we just explored and cranks it up to 11. First questions right here, Helminth, Archon Shards. Let's make this very darn quick. This build is ability spam heavy. You do need Nourish for the energy economy, otherwise this will not work. Archon Shards, go for as much ability strength as possible. Of course, right in the background, right, I only have one Gara, so naturally this is not fully optimized in the video. Which will then lead us already to the Gara builds. First of all, Shattered Lash, it's the same build as on the previous one. We go for the support stat stick type of build, where we either use melee retaliation if we want to go into more shields, or if we don't have that many shields, go for melee exposure. That is the options that we have. The Gara build itself then, well, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. Also here, not every single mod here is set in stone. You can mix and match, and we're gonna get into that right now. Corrosive projection in the aura, so enemies take more damage. If you wanted to have the scaling a little bit higher, you could go for steel charge, just like I said in the previous build. Also here, we go for Arcane Sculptor, which will give us so much efficiency that we don't need a flow mod, and 225 energy is more than enough. And all the energy income that we generate here is Archon Stretch and maybe a Xeneric Focus School for another 5 energy a second. That is absolutely everything we need because we have Nourish, which will multiply the energy income, and everything else just basically costs 0 thanks to Arcane Sculptor. Also, with this build then, we go for as much range as we can get away with Overextended as well as Archon Stretch. Survivability comes from Primary Direction and Adaptation in combination with Arcane Aegis, but just like with the previous one, if you wanna go for even more damage, faster scaling, you can go for Arcane Expertise, which will increase the shield pool based on our ability strength, so that is personal preference. The interesting part here though is where the damage comes from, and that is also the reason we go with Precision Intensify, because this ability NUKE build is meant to deal the damage mostly with Mass Vitrify. Remember, you can blow up Mass Vitrify by casting Shattered Lash into it. Well, that is exactly what we're doing here, but under the influence of Shattered Storm. This augment makes it that all the damage that we have in our Splinter Storm is going to be added onto the explosion of Mass Vitrify as well. So it not only scales with whatever is on our Shattered Lash, but also whatever is stored in our Splinter Storm. And this makes it then that the explosion of the glass wall just absolutely nukes away the entire room. It is totally crazy, and while it is not a build that hasn't existed before, you could have already done that in the past, the fact that we have Arcane Sculptor now that locks our efficiency at 175%, that gives us so much spammability that this build desperately needs that it kinda sorta is a necessity in order to make this really playable. But now, also check out my top 10 Warframe list for 2026 right here. Big thank you to Demon Arzel, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nos Linux Gaming, Ondakanio 2, Pepperwolf, Mihawki, Sokatesti, Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Hantakas, Patrosator, Boomia1, Zafe, Almendai, Azengen, Quax, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everin 8802, Gabriel Tevez, Yaku Ivan Gonzalez, G.E. Schnoz, Muffdisk, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.